On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Zachary Hanif. He is the VP of AI, ML, and Data at Twilio. We're going to be talking about driving B2B AI innovation. And we're going to be talking about some of those tools that you need, the building blocks, that engine that you have to actually get these projects going. And we're going to talk about where those projects are, POCs, trends in what applications are working. And we're going to talk about when to know when you're going into production and factors to consider when you're actually deciding to go to production. Zachary, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Amir.
Awesome. All right, before we start, I know a lot of people probably know what Twilio does, but I just want to make sure they heard it from you.
Sure, absolutely. So I think most developers, certainly developers, probably know Twilio as a text messaging company because when the company was founded and for much of its growth, we kind of pioneered bringing a lot of those communications in an accessible way to the cloud. But we do a lot more than that, right? Over the last several years, Twilio has been growing massively, becoming this much larger customer experience platform. And our mission is to help businesses bring together things like data that they have on their customers, the communication channels that they support for communicating with their audiences, and the intelligence necessary to kind of understand the customers and personalize their interactions at scale.
All right. Well, I think we're going to be talking about some of those things. And, I guess to start off, we're talking about companies driving B2B AI innovation. Obviously, I think there's companies that are building AI tools, as you just indicated, and there's companies trying to leverage those tools to build AI applications. Let's talk about the tools, right? So you mentioned being the engine. Can you kind of talk to us about if you're a company, you're an enterprise, and you want to build AI into your company, you're not going to do that from scratch, right? You're going to go find a platform, you're going to find tools. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that most companies, as they start down this journey, are definitely going to be tool users as opposed to tool producers, right? Isn't that kind of always the way that things work, right? It's fun to build things from first principles, but not always efficient. And so one of the things that I think we've seen internal to Twilio, I've seen inside of the larger ecosystem as a whole, is that when companies go out and begin engaging in the tools environment, they need to first go through and identify, hey, this is the use case that we're specifically going to attempt to tackle. These are the tools that directly enable that use case. But I think the most important part of any kind of tools-based conversation is the identification of where you can bring in tooling that addresses common commodity or easily extrapolatable needs that more than one group is going to likely have, you being one of them, and then identifying areas in your specific use case where that organization, the company, the individual, whatever it might be that's trying to put together a solution, can clearly identify that they have a distinguishing factor where they need to control their own destiny, if that makes sense. That identification is a huge step in any process.
I guess a question there. So as you're kind of going through that identification, and obviously when technology shifts happen, we see a lot of companies obviously are leveraging tools to get to where they need to go. As you're kind of seeing what's possible, right? I mean, you always hear about the art of the possible when a technologist is describing what something, the impact it could have on the business, right? The art of possible, because we talk about it. In this case, the art of the possible almost seems like it could be way too big. Like if you start with that, I mean, you might be trying to boil the ocean. When you're looking at providing this type of engine, having the ability to integrate at different points, provide different value, where do companies start? And I guess I know a lot of people love the chatbot, right? That's an easy one. People can see the one-to-one. That seems like low-hanging fruit from a lot of people you talk about. But is that really where people should be starting? Is that the right starting point when they're thinking about AI projects?
So, I hesitate to tell teams where specifically they should start because I don't understand everyone's use cases, right? To be really, really clear, there's absolutely situations where starting with a chatbot is probably your first and best bet, right? But in the same breath, I would also say that that's not always going to be the case, right? One of the things that's incredible when you sit down with kind of the modern environment that we find ourselves in with large language models and all the supporting infrastructure that kind of surrounds them is that they are such incredibly powerful tools, it's almost like being back at the dawn of the age of computing, right? Like if we think back, like late 80s, early 90s kind of time frame here, when computers were starting to like become more of a thing that you started to see in people's homes, as opposed to exclusively in mainframes in the basements of major companies or universities. What you started to see was people were exposed to an incredibly powerful tool that could do a lot for them. And I think they probably felt the same level of trepidation because they were given a huge field in which to play in to be able to solve their particular problems. And so this is kind of why I've told teams historically, understand your use case first. Before doing anything else, make sure you know what problem it is you're trying to solve, because that will lead you towards what tools you want to use, what capabilities make themselves available, and what affordances you can rely on to be able to go out and build your solution. If you come into it with a technology and not a firm understanding of that problem, you're going to solve a problem that isn't there in probably the best case. And in the worst case, you're going to create a wonderful tech demo, right? That might be something that's viable or useful in its own right sometimes, but it probably isn't for most people who are starting on a journey like this. One of the things that I said a moment ago was I used the word affordances, right, which is a term you probably hear most from designers and people who build UIs. And I think that the question that you asked, Amir, is very much a user experience question in the exact same way as it could be perceived as a requirements question as well. One of the things that is most exciting about LLMs today is that text box, the ability to just pose plain English requests and get plain English responses about an incredibly wide range of problems, of data, of information, goes a long way. And that is a user interface in and of itself, if you're exposing the text box directly to an end user. But that can be intimidating, just as you had said. And so I really do encourage teams to understand that use case first before deciding on what they're going to expose. Otherwise, you can find yourself in a situation where the freedom that these technologies can bring you itself becomes a limiter.
That's interesting. And I do actually think the UX, I've brought it up a couple of times, and I'm going to bring it up with you because I'm not sure that I've ever fully... and I think it's early, right? So I don't think anyone has the answer. But I guess if you were to go back, Google had the first search engine webpage we saw from them was just the text box, right? It was text box on the screen, and famously 2 buttons. And obviously here we are. It's kind of transformed over the last couple of decades. When we think of the other LLMs that are out there that people are interacting with, and it's very much a text box, put some type of question and wait for some type of response. It kind of reminds me of that. But also then the evolution of that has kind of changed. When you're thinking about, and I'm talking about maybe enterprise, B2B customers, when you're thinking about where their minds go when they see this and what they have to kind of go through to see the use cases, right? And I think the challenge sometimes is we see that, and to come up with a use case that breaks that mold isn't easy because we just haven't seen it. Is there some friction there, or is that just it's still early and we're just kind of at the onset no matter what?
Yeah, I think we are still early, and I think that is a part of it, right? We, like, the industry as a whole and humanity as a entity, right, goes through these cycles. When new powerful technology is presented, there tends to be waves of acceptance based on how we see that technology actually being used, and that can range. It's everything from, hey, what is considered societally acceptable? It's from, hey, how have we thought about this problem before, right? Like, if you study most major technological innovations, those that have been here for a little while, you can obviously see how the world starts thinking about a technology in a particular way, and then sooner or later someone with an innovation comes out, either in modifying the technology itself, allowing it to be used for something else, or in simply identifying, hey, we can start leveraging this in a way that we haven't thought of before, right? And I think that the field for AI is moving so quickly right now, and it is so young, that we still haven't quite hit that magic moment where we're beginning to think about things wildly differently, right? We're seeing, obviously, that blank text box, the interaction with a single model, the integration of agentic AI capabilities, our friends in the open source and communities have LangChain and LangGraph, ways of being able to create workflows, if you want to think about it that way, or pipelines of interaction with LLMs and other pieces of technology in the ecosystem. And so you see a lot of that material, but we are still seeing it ultimately as a search and retrieval mechanism where a human is interacting with some interface to be able to ask generalized questions or request generalized actions for a specific piece of data and then getting specific responses back, right? I think one of the things that's the most exciting to me, and you see this with every major technical paradigm shift, is you start in those easy to understand, or at least very emotionally resonant kind of use cases to begin with. And then over time, you start to see innovators come up with new ways of being able to use it. And I think that's something that we're probably right on the cusp of for this, certainly. And we're starting to see more and more about right now. And that's an exciting time.
I agree with you. Yeah, everything you said 100% resonates. And, as I'm listening, we've kind of started talking about the use cases, what people should be looking at. You mentioned start with the use case first. Obviously, to go from that use case to a POC, you need something done. And I was going to ask you, in this case, when it comes to AI products, how does a POC within the AI space, and it could be Gen AI or a different form, it doesn't matter, how does that look different? Because I guess if you were to think about POCs done in other technology shifts, right? An application, data, there's a lot of quick and dirty things to make something look a certain way. But with this, there's got to be a trust factor within that POC so people go, oh, okay, I can see using this is going to benefit me. Is the POC within AI inherently different? Are there different standards to it than other things?
That's a great question. I think there's like a multifaceted answer there. I think from the first step, in terms of, hey, does the introduction of AI create an environment where the POC process is fundamentally different? I think the answer to that is probably no. The POC process is an iterative one. Demonstrate your idea, demonstrate where that idea could probably apply, and then demonstrate that idea can go plus one step, right? Maybe you're scaling it, maybe you're going deeper, but the goal of a POC is to do fundamentally those three things, right, at the end of the day. When you take a look at this from bringing AI into the equation, that component of it stays the same. I think the thing that you're touching on, which I deeply agree with, is the way your audience will respond to a non-human interaction. One of the things that's, both exciting and a little scary about AI is the fact that we now have automated systems that do an exceptional job at impersonating the way humans interact with each other, the way they talk, the information they provide. And if you're talking about audio, generative models, they can imitate speech patterns and all sorts of other great stuff. And I think one of the things that's important with POCs, both in the traditional realm and in the AI realm, is how you are communicating that POC's intent, capabilities, and affordances to your customer, your proposed customer. For a website, you have to communicate your message in a very particular way, and I think that's exactly the same inside of the AI space. How do you allow your model, for lack of more generalized terms, but how do you create your POC in such a way to be able to turn around and present itself effectively to a human? Humans are great at identifying things that look like humans but aren't quite right, and that's the uncanny valley for us right there. And I do think that has become much more of a concern than it ever was before. You don't get the uncanny valley effect for most traditional software as a service companies or other POCs like that, and now that is a concern inside of the AI space. And so one of the things that I would encourage teams to do is to do more user testing than they have probably done previously, and make sure that they have smaller audiences. You're looking for audiences that respond to your POC in the way that you anticipated them responding. And now you're looking for audiences who react negatively because your generative output does not sound sufficiently human, feels uncomfortable, or any of the other things that humans, when they're interacting with other humans, can have as a negative experience. And so testing for that and looking for that, I think that's still a similar concern to what has historically existed, but you're now asking different questions than you have historically asked in the specific.
The UX is evolving, is changing. Within the AI space, if you're a team, you're a company trying to put these solutions in place, do you have to have a distinctly different type of UX person working on these AI projects? I mean, I guess if you're a company that you're trying to build this out, you have tools, I get that. But the other side of that, the UX for your audience, how do you bridge that gap? Because obviously to go to production, that UX is inherently important, as you just kind of alluded to, that feel, that comfort of you're getting out. Where does the UX head for these people running POCs?
Well, you definitely need to have a systems thinking mindset, because you're no longer interacting with something that has point in time individualistic points of interaction with your user. You are definitely interacting in an environment where every interaction has a chain of events that are deeply linked. Everything from the first point of the user first interacting with the model itself, could be a text box in our previously discussed examples, right? To the way that the generated material is displayed, what caveats you put around it, and how you communicate to that user, what context you're bringing into the equation. All of that is incredibly important. Even when you walk into a world where you're using a model as part of a human in the loop interaction, where you're using a model to be able to drive a job assistance mechanism, one of the most important things for you to do is to really look at that output, because the output itself, let's say you're a marketer, for example, or someone who is using a generative AI to be able to put out into the world a body of content that will go to a mass audience or even a very specific one, you now have two different systems you need to analyze. The system that is supporting that human as they create this content, right? And the output of that process. You're actually looking at two different environments now, where you have two different user interfaces for two sets of users that are deeply intertwined. The content creator, right, and their eventual audience. Thinking of that as an entire system, a feedback loop, and instrumenting that in different ways so that way you're able to respond appropriately. Thinking about that as something that might be an ongoing cycle, as opposed to simply a series of single isolated atomic events. That would be what I'm looking for. I don't think you need a completely different type of designer by any stretch of the imagination, but you definitely want a designer who has focused on their, tip to tail oriented interactions, even when there is a handoff between two different user groups.
I guess we've been kind of talking, we've been walking through the process. We've talked about use cases, production, going to POCs. Obviously, production is something that 2025 is supposed to be the year of production. At least that's what people are thinking. As these projects are now going through the POC phase, do we understand when we should flip the switch to go to production? Are there good baselines to know, hey, you've had this POC in place, it's been working, it's a good time to actually try to expand the audience?
So that is always something that changes based on a use case in a business and environments like that, right? The barrier between doing that for, say, someone inside of the health services industry and someone doing that inside of like the copywriting industry, for example, the marketing environment, those are going to be very different things. And even then there's greater nuance within it. So everything that I'm about to say, please don't take this as gospel and turn around somewhere and say, aha, this guy said it, and so that applies universally. So that's the caveat. That having been said, I do think that you still largely exist inside of an environment where the previous rules of the road for being able to determine when your POC is ready for production largely still apply. I think that you should make sure that there's additional testing, because you want to exercise enough of the paths of your model to be able to see, hey, we have a representative large quantity of content. I would say that this is similar to the concept of degrees of freedom and affordances, just degrees of freedom that you would see inside of any UI. And I would encourage anyone doing a POC of any kind, if you intend to open that to a mass audience, you want to do a fair amount of testing to make sure that when people start using your tool, you have some way of anticipating or at least understanding how that tool gets used. Anyone who's ever built something that large numbers of people use know that the time between your users starting to interact with the tool and then using it in a way you did not necessarily intend is way shorter than anyone's ever comfortable with, right? And I think that with powerful tools like LLMs, you're going to see that more and more and more. And so the first thing that I would say for, hey, how do you know when you're ready is, have you really exercised this thing to get an understanding of what the interaction points are, what degrees of freedom you give your consumer, and how are they likely to use it? The second thing I would say before you actually launch something is make sure you have strong instrumentation. Really understand how your users are behaving, because you've given them more capabilities than most things that we as developers have traditionally been accustomed to. The final thing that I would say is this. Because LLMs come with their own very unique price scaling model at the end of the day, self-hosted, third-party hosted, doesn't matter where it is, right? It is a form of cost that I would say is very, very important. So have a very deep understanding on a use case by use case basis of what your terms of success are. You need to understand what success looks like and how you would objectively measure it. And then having come to that understanding, make sure that you're monitoring that both in realized terms. Hey, these are the number of click-throughs or user events or whatever it is you're trying to measure for something like engagement, but also in terms of real dollars. Hey, my cost per inference is X, Y, or Z, right? I think that those things are very important. The last thing that I would say, and this is because, in my background, most of my applied work exists inside of adversarial fields, cybersecurity, things like that, is LLMs are powerful tools and they expose a new form of surface area that you probably haven't interacted with before, right? Or most people probably haven't. And so you definitely want to make sure that you've got a body of concerns that look like security concerns, things like identifying and preventing toxicity, things like ensuring that you've properly segmented your user data. If you're using like a vector DB or you're taking user input, there's an entirely new world there. And I think that there's definitely an environment where you want to be able to do some form of security vetting before it goes live, even if that is shallow in some cases, just simply because it is a new form of surface area and we're discovering new things every day.
Maybe the last question, and I think that's fantastic, by the way. And as you're talking through that, and you mentioned the surface area, with something like this, obviously all applications data grows. With this, the surface area feels like it might grow faster than other applications, that you might be growing into areas that are potentially unanticipated, or your model might be learning differently to what you thought. When you factor that in, and obviously just curious because your background, you've dealt with this, how do you deal with that? How do you start building solutions around that to make sure that you don't end up going too far sideways?
Sure. Well, there's a point in here where we transition from a POC, which should come with appropriate caveats, to a full production instance, right? But there's the general concept that exists in the world of model risk management, which, if I was going to distill down to almost a reckless level of summarization, I would say could be summarized in the phrase, how do you know that your model is doing what you intended it to do? If I had to distill the entire model risk management field down to just that, that's what I would say. I beg forgiveness for anyone who's currently working at a financial institution who just got very angry about how I have wildly summarized that statement. My belief is that especially as you go out more and more, you are developing out a body of tooling that is by design oriented towards doing material that you have not explicitly programmed it to perform. So in the same way that application developers have historically needed to understand kind of the branch paths that they have inside of their execution flow and understand how a user could navigate through an anticipated workflow or data flow or something along those lines. With LLMs, you now have far more than that available to you. And so you definitely want to make sure that you have at least performed a wider stretch of caution around, hey, this is what it is enabling, this is what it is doing, and this is how I can expose its context, right, for its operation to the user, right? Do I think that it's growing at such a speed that it's moving faster than anything before? I don't think that's necessarily true. Surface area is like that, right? You have something that doubles in surface area, doubles in surface area, doubles in surface area, and it looks different each time it does so, just because at some point it's so big, it's hard for you to wrap your head around it. I would not say that it's a completely new concept, certainly for anyone inside of this overall space for security in user interaction modeling. But I would say that there are a number of assumptions which have historically been true. For example, the user can only do the things, or primarily can only do the things that we have explicitly created execution paths for, right? Where that's no longer true. You just don't know the full scope of the execution paths anymore. And so constructing around that, building around that, those are things that I want teams to be thinking about, especially as they mature from a POC into like a full-fledged solution. And again, I'm sorry that this is general advice, but that's going to look different on a case-by-case basis. But it's not a concern that you can ever hand away to someone else. You internally need a way, especially if you're building your models and not using them in a SaaS model, right? Especially if you're building them, you need a way of consistently ensuring that as you train and retrain those models, the overall performance, the objective metrics that you're looking for, the efficacy things that you're trying to measure, and the effect that you get out of that is well understood, well monitored, and controlled for.
Zachary, I know you got to get back to the day job. Maybe we're gonna have to do a part 2, because I think where you just stopped is where everyone's gonna be like, "Where's the rest of that? I want to now know about the security side of it." So maybe we'll have you back on if we could. And I really do appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time. This is fantastic. And in terms of reaching out and connecting with you and potentially being able to follow up with you, what's a good way of doing that?
Well, I'm certainly always reachable via email. I'll give that to you, Amir, so that we can put it inside of a textual format. And then I'm reachable from a couple of other locations as well. So I'll send you those links, and we can get them transmitted out.
Okay, well, make sure we include those so people can reach out and ask you a follow-up. I'm sure we didn't answer all those questions, but I really do appreciate your time. Thank you for joining. Thank you for sharing.
Amir, thank you so much for having me. I'd love the chance to sit down with you again. This has been great.
Absolutely. All right, that's it for the episode. Be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, 2 things. One, I think we started off talking about driving B2B AI innovation. Obviously, we covered a lot of ground. We went from talking about those building blocks, the engines, to POCs, actually use cases of POCs, and then actually production. And we started touching on some of the actual model risk management as well. Covered a lot of ground. Please share this with somebody else, this episode with somebody who's going to find value out of it. I think it was a fantastic show. I think very timely, actually, where we are at with a lot of these projects in POC stages. So I'd appreciate that. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how you guys like the show. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.